Sometimes the worst day of your life comes disguised as the luckiest. Red McAllister learned this truth the hard way when he lost his wife and grandson in a wildfire, then discovered he was worth $100 million just 3 days later. The old mountain man had been wandering the back roads of Montana with nothing but his cattle dog and a broken heart. Folks thought grief had finally cracked his mind when they saw him talking to himself and sleeping under fence posts. Then a fancy lawyer in a black carriage found him walking in the dust. The man brought news about an old mine claim Red had sold for pocket change decades ago. That worthless hole in the ground had just become the richest strike in Montana history. Now Red faced an impossible question. When you've lost everything that gave your life meaning, what do you do with enough money to buy back the whole world? This is the story of how one broken man discovered that sometimes your greatest fortune comes when you think you have nothing left to lose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Sarah died, she'd made Red his favorite breakfast buckwheat pancakes with real maple syrup, the kind that cost too much but tasted like childhood memories. She'd kissed his weathered cheek and told him to be careful checking the fence line up on Eagle Ridge. "Tommy's coming next week," she'd reminded him, her eyes bright with the anticipation that always came before their grandson's summer visits. "Don't you dare work yourself to death before then." Red had laughed, the sound echoing off the log walls of their cabin. At 68, he moved slower than he used to, his left knee protesting every morning like an old friend with too many complaints. But the high country of Montana had been his home for 43 years, and he knew every trail, every creek, every stand of timber like others knew the rooms of their houses. He'd built their life here with his own hands, first the cabin, then the small barn, the chicken coop, the vegetable garden that Sarah tended with the same patience she'd brought to teaching second graders for 30 years. "You worry too much, woman," he'd said, pulling on his worn work boots. Blue, their cattle dog, had already positioned himself by the door, tail wagging with the eager anticipation of a day's work. The dog was getting grey around the muzzle, but he still had the heart of a young pup when it came to herding and hiking. Sarah had handed him his lunch pail, packed with the same care she'd shown for decades. Inside would be 2 roast beef sandwiches on her homemade bread, an apple from their own tree, and oatmeal cookies that could make a grown man weep. "I don't worry," she'd said, straightening his collar with the gentle touch of a woman who'd loved the same man for 45 years. "I just know. You get lost in your thoughts up there, forget to eat, forget to drink water, forget you're not 30 anymore." The truth was, Red had been thinking a lot lately about time and memory. Maybe it was Tommy's upcoming visit, or maybe it was the way Sarah had started talking about retirement, about what they'd do when Red finally hung up his tools. She wanted to travel, see the ocean again, visit her sister in Oregon, maybe take Tommy to Yellowstone for a real vacation, instead of just day trips. Red had nodded and agreed, but part of him couldn't imagine leaving this place. Every board in their cabin held a memory. Every trail he'd walked 1,000 times felt like an old conversation with the land itself. Tommy was 8 now, old enough to really appreciate the mountains. Last summer, Red had carved him a wooden horse from a piece of pine, complete with a flowing mane and detailed legs. The boy had clutched it like treasure, galloping it across the cabin's wooden floors while making elaborate sound effects. "When I grow up, Grandpa, I want to live here too," Tommy had announced. "We can build another cabin right next to yours, and I can take care of the animals when you get too old." "Too old?" Red had feigned offense. "Boy, I'll be working these mountains when you're the one with grey whiskers." But even as he'd said it, Red had felt the weight of years in his bones. The logging work that had sustained them for decades was mostly behind him now. The Forest Service contracts had dried up, and the younger men with their mechanized equipment could clear more timber in a day than Red could in a week. He'd adapted, taking on smaller jobs, fence repair for neighboring ranches, firewood cutting for the town below, the occasional carpentry project. Sarah's teacher's pension helped, but they weren't getting rich. They were getting by, which had always been enough. That morning, Red had spent 6 hours mending fence line, replacing rotted posts and tightening wire that had gone slack over the winter. Blue had worked beside him, alert for the deer and elk that sometimes wandered too close to their property line. The dog had a gentle way with wildlife, firm enough to move them along, but never aggressive. Red appreciated that. There was room for everything in these mountains if you just learned to share the space respectfully. When Red had finally headed home, the sun was already sinking toward the western peaks. He'd been later than usual, distracted by a section of fence that had needed more work than expected. The smell had reached him first, not the familiar scent of Sarah's dinner cooking, but something sharper, more acrid. Smoke, but not the pleasant wood smoke of their fireplace. By the time he'd crested the last hill before home, the entire southern horizon was glowing orange. The wind had picked up, carrying ash and the terrifying roar of a wildfire moving fast through dry timber. Red's heart had hammered against his ribs as he'd pushed his old truck harder than he should have, racing down the familiar dirt road that led home. But he'd been too late. The fire had moved with the speed of a living thing, hungry and indiscriminate. Their cabin, their barn, everything they'd built together was gone. In its place was a hellscape of glowing embers and twisted metal. The volunteer fire department was already there, but they were fighting to contain the blaze, not to save what was already lost. Tommy had arrived early, Sarah had told the neighbors later, a surprise visit while his parents were dealing with some crisis in Denver. She'd picked him up from the bus station that afternoon, delighted to have an extra day with her grandson. They'd been making cookies in the kitchen when the fire jumped the creek and raced up the valley like a demon set loose from hell. The fire chief, a man Red had known for 20 years, had found him standing in the ruins 3 hours later, still calling their names. "Red," he'd said, his voice heavy with the weight of bad news. "We found them in the kitchen. Looks like they tried to get out the back door. But the smoke, it would have been fast. Red, they wouldn't have suffered." Those words had broken something fundamental inside Red McAllister. Sarah and Tommy, the two people who had given his life meaning and purpose, were gone. Not just gone taken by a fire that had started from a downed power line 30 miles away, a random act of nature and human carelessness that had consumed everything he loved. The next 3 days had passed in a haze of grief and shock. The funeral arrangements, the insurance calls, the well-meaning neighbors who brought casseroles and spoke in hushed tones about God's plan, it all felt like watching someone else's life through a thick pane of glass. Red had walked through it all, Blue at his side, feeling like a ghost in his own story. He'd stayed those first nights with Martha Henderson, Sarah's closest friend and fellow teacher. Martha had insisted, refusing to let him sleep in his truck or wander off into the wilderness like some wounded animal. But Red couldn't stand the sympathy in her eyes, couldn't bear the way she looked at him like he might shatter at any moment. So on the third morning, he'd gathered what little he had left, some clothes donated by neighbors, a few personal items that had survived in the shed, and Blue, and he'd started walking. He didn't have a destination in mind. The high country that had once been his sanctuary now felt haunted by memories. Every trail reminded him of walks with Sarah. Every clearing brought back Tommy's laughter. So Red had headed down the mountain instead, following back roads he'd rarely traveled, moving through the lower valleys like a man searching for something he couldn't name. Blue had stayed close, sensing his master's pain with the intuitive wisdom that dogs possess. The old cattle dog had lost his home too, but his loyalty never wavered. When Red stopped walking, Blue stopped. When Red talked to the empty sky, carrying on conversations with Sarah and Tommy that neighbors found disturbing, Blue listened without judgment. That was how the lawyer had found them on that third evening. A broken old man and his faithful dog, walking along a dusty county road with everything they owned in a canvas bag. Red had been talking to Sarah again, telling her about the sunset, when the black carriage had rolled up beside them like something from another century. The lawyer was a thin man in an expensive suit, with soft hands and city manners that seemed absurdly out of place on that rural Montana road. He'd introduced himself as Harold Whitman, from the law firm of Whitman, Pierce and Associates in Billings. He'd been searching for Red for 2 days, following leads from the fire department and local authorities. "Mr. McAllister," he'd said, his voice careful and professional, "I have some news that might surprise you. It concerns a mining claim you sold in 1972. Red stared at the thin man in the expensive suit, trying to make sense of words that seemed to come from another world entirely. A mining claim from 1972? He'd sold that worthless piece of rock for barely enough money to keep himself in whiskey for a month. That was back when Sarah had threatened to leave him if he didn't get his drinking under control, back when he was young and stupid and thought the mountains owed him something more than they were willing to give. "I don't understand," Red said, his voice hoarse from 3 days of grief and dust. Blue pressed against his leg, sensing the tension in the air. "That claim was nothing but a hole in the ground. Sold it to some mining company for $200. Harold Whitman reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. The original mine deed was on top a piece of paper so old and yellowed that Red barely recognized his own signature at the bottom. His younger self had signed it with the confident flourish of a man who thought he was getting away with something, selling rock and dirt to city folks who didn't know better. The Consolidated Mining Company went bankrupt in 1974, Whitman explained, adjusting his spectacles. When they liquidated their assets, this particular claim reverted back to you, according to the terms of the original sale agreement. You probably never received notification because you'd moved, and frankly the claim appeared worthless at the time. Red took the deed with trembling fingers, studying the legal language that might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. Sarah had always handled the paperwork in their marriage, taxes, insurance, anything that required more than a basic education. Looking at the document now, Red felt the full weight of his limitations pressing down on him like a physical thing. 3 weeks ago, Whitman continued, a geological survey team working for Apex Resource Development discovered what appears to be one of the richest silver and rare earth mineral deposits ever found in this region. The initial estimates suggest the claim could be worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 million. The words hit Red like physical blows. $100 million. He'd heard those kinds of numbers on television, read them in newspapers when they talked about lottery winners or movie stars. They were numbers that belonged to other people, in other worlds, not to a broken-down mountain man standing on a back road with nothing but a dog and a canvas bag. "That can't be right," Red said, shaking his head. "I sold that claim clean, fair and square. You sold it with a reversion clause," Whitman explained patiently. "If the purchasing company failed to maintain active mining operations for more than 5 consecutive years, ownership would revert to the original claimant. Consolidated never mined the site. They were primarily interested in timber, rights on adjacent properties. When they went bankrupt, your claim became active again." Red felt dizzy, the grief and shock of the past 3 days, combining with this impossible news to create a fog in his mind that he couldn't think through clearly. Sarah would have known what to do. Sarah would have asked the right questions, read the fine print, protected them from whatever trap this surely had to be. But Sarah was gone, and Red was standing alone on a dusty road, trying to understand how his life had gone from complete devastation to unimaginable wealth in the space of a single conversation. "There are some complications, of course," Whitman continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Several other parties have filed claims against the property. Some distant relatives of yours have come forward, arguing that they should share in any inheritance. There's also the matter of environmental impact studies, mining rights versus conservation concerns, and the current political climate regarding resource extraction on former federal lands." The mention of relatives made Red's stomach turn. He hadn't spoken to most of his family in decades, cousins and second cousins scattered across 3 states, people who'd never visited, never called, never cared whether he lived or died. Now, suddenly, they were interested in his affairs. "What kind of relatives?" Red asked. Whitman consulted his notes. "Your late brother's children from California, your sister's family from Oregon, a few others who claim some connection to your father's estate. They've hired their own legal representation, and they're arguing that such a large inheritance should be distributed among all surviving family members." Red thought about his brother Dale, who died 5 years ago from lung cancer. Dale had been a successful car salesman in Los Angeles, the kind of man who wore gold chains and talked too loud, and had always made Red feel like a country bumpkin. Dale's kids, Red, could barely remember their names had been raised with every advantage, sent to expensive schools, given opportunities Red had never dreamed of. The idea that they now wanted a piece of something that belonged to him made anger bubble up through his grief. "They didn't want anything to do with me when I was poor," Red said quietly. "Sarah and I invited them to our anniversary party 10 years ago. Not one of them came." "I understand your frustration," Whitman said. "But legally, they have the right to contest the inheritance, especially given its size. However, I believe your claim is strong. The original deed is clear, and the reversion clause is ironclad. With proper legal representation, I'm confident we can protect your interests." The lawyer pulled out more documents, papers that needed signatures, forms that required personal information, contracts for legal representation that Red couldn't begin to understand. The sheer volume of paperwork was overwhelming, each page representing decisions that could affect the rest of his life. "I need time to think," Red said, stepping backward as if the documents might bite him. "This is all too much. 3 days ago I lost everything that mattered to me. Now you're telling me I'm rich? It doesn't make sense." "I understand this is overwhelming," Whitman said, his voice gentler now. "But time is a factor here. The other claimants are already taking legal action. Apex Resource Development is eager to begin negotiations for mining rights. Every day we delay gives them more opportunity to complicate matters." Red looked down at Blue, who was watching the exchange with the patient attention of a dog who'd learned that human conversations often took longer than they should. The old cattle dog had been his only constant companion through the worst days of his life. Unlike lawyers and relatives and mining companies, Blue's loyalty wasn't conditional on bank account balances. "Where am I supposed to live while all this gets sorted out?" Red asked. "I don't have a home anymore. Don't have anything except what's in this bag." "That's another matter we should discuss," Whitman said. "Your newfound wealth means you'll have access to resources you've never had before. You could buy a house, rent a place in town, stay at the finest hotel in Billings while we work through the legal issues. Money is no longer a constraint for you, Mr. McAllister." The absurdity of that statement hit Red like a physical blow. Money was no longer a constraint? Money had been the least of his constraints for 43 years. What constrained him was losing the only 2 people who'd made his life worth living. What constrained him was the fact that all the money in the world couldn't bring back Sarah's laugh or Tommy's eager questions about the mountains. What constrained him was grief so deep it felt like drowning. "I need to think," Red repeated, clutching the original mind deed like it might disappear if he let go. "I need to go back to where my house used to be. I need to see what's left." Whitman nodded reluctantly. "I can drive you there if you'd like. We need to stay in contact during this process. There are decisions that can't wait indefinitely." Red looked at the black carriage. Actually, a luxury sedan that had seemed like something from another century in his grief-fogged state of mind. The idea of riding in such an expensive vehicle felt wrong somehow, like putting on clothes that belonged to someone else. But his feet were sore from 3 days of walking, and Blue was getting old for such long journeys. "All right," Red said finally, "but after that, I need some time alone. Just me and Blue. I need to figure out what any of this means." As they drove toward the ruins of his old life, Red clutched the mine deed and tried to understand how fate could be so cruel and so generous at the same moment. In his pocket was Sarah's wedding ring, found in the ashes of their bedroom, the only piece of his former life he'd managed to save. Now, apparently, he had enough money to buy 1,000 wedding rings, but only one woman had ever deserved to wear his. The ruins of Red's cabin looked different in the fading evening light, less like the end of the world and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. He stood at the edge of what had been their front yard, Blue sitting quietly beside him, and tried to reconcile this blackened skeleton of twisted metal and charred wood with the home where he'd lived for 43 years. Whitman had dropped him off with promises to call tomorrow, leaving behind business cards and documents that Red had stuffed into his canvas bag without really looking at them. The silence after the lawyer's expensive car disappeared down the mountain road felt like a blessing. For the first time in 3 days, Red could think without someone else's voice in his head, telling him what he needed to do, what he needed to sign, what he needed to understand about his sudden change in fortune. He picked his way carefully through the debris, Blue following with the cautious steps of an animal who understood that this place held sadness. The concrete foundation was intact, marking the outline of rooms that had once contained their entire life together. Here was where the kitchen had been, where Sarah had made breakfast that last morning. There was the spot where their bedroom had stood, where they'd shared 45 years of whispered conversations and comfortable silences. It was in the ruins of the bedroom that Red found Sarah's recipe box, somehow protected from the worst of the fire by falling debris. The metal box was dented and blackened, but when he pried it open with his pocket knife, the index cards inside were mostly readable. Sarah's careful handwriting filled each card, measurements in her neat script, notes about which recipes Tommy liked best, modifications she'd made over the years to accommodate Red's preferences. Red pulled out a card at random. Oatmeal cookies, Tommy's favorite. Below the ingredients, Sarah had written notes. Extra cinnamon, Red says, reminds him of his mother. Make smaller than usual, easier for Tommy's hands. Always let him help measure. The simple words hit Red harder than all the lawyers' talk about millions of dollars. This was wealth. He understood the accumulated wisdom of a woman who'd made their house into a home through thousands of small acts of love. He spent an hour going through the recipe box, reading Sarah's notes, and remembering meals that had marked the passage of their years together. Birthday cakes and holiday dinners, the special soup she made when Red was sick, the elaborate picnic lunches she'd pack for their summer hikes. Each recipe was a story, a moment in their shared history that the fire couldn't touch. By the time he finished, full darkness had settled over the valley. Red made a simple camp in what had been their vegetable garden, using skills learned from decades of mountain living. Blue curled up close to the small fire, and Red settled against his canvas bag with Sarah's recipe box in his lap. That was when Martha Henderson found him. "Red McAllister, what in God's name are you doing out here?" Martha's voice cut through the darkness as her flashlight beam found his face. She emerged from the tree line like a determined spirit, carrying what looked like a care package and wearing an expression of mixed concern and exasperation. "Martha." Red struggled to his feet, suddenly aware of how he must look unshaven, unwashed, sitting in the ruins of his life like some kind of hermit. "I didn't expect." "Of course you didn't expect me," Martha said briskly. "You snuck out of town like a wounded bear, and everyone's been worried sick. Do you have any idea how many people have been looking for you?" Martha Henderson was 3 years younger than Sarah, but looked older, her grey hair always perfectly styled, her clothes practical but neat. She'd been Sarah's teaching partner for 15 years and Red's reluctant friend for almost as long. Where Sarah had been gentle and patient, Martha was direct and no-nonsense, the kind of woman who could manage a classroom full of 8-year-olds through sheer force of personality. "I needed to be alone," Red said. "Too many people wanting to talk to me about things I don't understand." "Like that lawyer from Billings?" Martha set down her package and fixed Red with the look she probably used on students who hadn't done their homework. Word travels fast in small towns, Red. Everyone knows about your inheritance. Half the people think you've lost your mind, and the other half are wondering if you'll remember them when you're rich. The bluntness of her statement caught Red off guard. He'd been so focused on his own confusion and grief that he hadn't considered how the news might affect his relationships with neighbors and friends. "I don't want to be rich," he said quietly. "I just want Sarah and Tommy back." Martha's expression softened. "Oh, honey, I know you do. We all want them back. Sarah was my best friend for 30 years, and Tommy was like a grandchild to me too. But wanting won't bring them back, and sitting out here in the ruins won't honor their memory." She unpacked her care package thermos of coffee, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a clean shirt, and other practical items Red hadn't thought to gather. "You're going to catch pneumonia sleeping rough like this. Sarah would box my ears if I let that happen." "I don't know what to do, Martha," Red admitted, accepting the offered coffee with gratitude. "That lawyer talks about millions of dollars like it's just numbers on paper. But I've got relatives crawling out of the woodwork wanting their share, and mining companies wanting to tear up the land, and everyone treating me different because they think I'm rich now." Martha sat down on a piece of foundation wall, studying. Red's face in the firelight. "Are you rich?" "I don't know. Maybe. The lawyer says so, but there's all kinds of legal complications. Other people trying to claim the money, environmental concerns, contracts I don't understand." Red gestured helplessly at his canvas bag, where all of Whitman's documents were stuffed together like a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Then you need help," Martha said simply. "Real help, not just lawyers who see dollar signs. You need someone who knew Sarah and Tommy, someone who understands what they would have wanted you to do with this opportunity." "What do you mean?" Martha smiled for the first time since arriving, the expression transforming her stern features. "Sarah talked about money sometimes, you know. Not often, because you two never had much to talk about. But she had dreams about what she'd do if you ever came into some real wealth. She wanted to help kids, Red. Kids like Tommy, kids who might not get the chances they deserved." Red felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and confusion that had been choking him for days. "She never told me that. Sarah knew you'd worry about being practical, about making sure you two were taken care of first. But in her heart, she was always a teacher. She wanted every child to have the opportunities Tommy was going to have. Good schools, books, chances to see the world beyond these mountains." Martha reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "She wrote this last Christmas, after Tommy's visit. She asked me to keep it, said it was just silly dreaming, but maybe someday." Martha handed Red the paper. "Maybe someday it wouldn't be so silly." Red unfolded the paper with hands that shook slightly. Sarah's familiar handwriting filled the page, not a recipe this time, but a list of dreams. Scholarship fund for mountain kids, new library for the elementary school, summer camp for children who've never seen wilderness, reading, program for struggling students. Looking at Sarah's dreams written in her careful script, Red felt purpose stirring in his chest for the first time since the fire. Maybe Martha was right. Maybe sitting in the ruins wasn't the way to honor Sarah and Tommy's memory. Maybe the inheritance wasn't a cruel joke from fate. Maybe it was a chance to do something that mattered, something that would make their deaths mean more than just an ending. Martha insisted Red come back to town, at least until he could make proper arrangements. She wouldn't take no for an answer, using the same tone she'd probably perfected on 30 years of stubborn students. Red found himself loading Blue into her practical sedan, Sarah's recipe box, and his canvas bag representing the sum total of his worldly possessions. The spare bedroom in Martha's neat ranch house felt like a luxury hotel compared to sleeping rough in the ruins, but Red couldn't shake the feeling that he was imposing on kindness he didn't deserve. Martha seemed to read his thoughts over breakfast the next morning. "Stop looking like a whipped dog," she said, setting down a plate of eggs and bacon that reminded Red painfully of Sarah's cooking. "You're not charity, Red. You're family, And family helps family. Sarah would do the same for me if our situations were reversed. Red nodded, but couldn't quite meet her eyes. The truth was, everything felt different now. Even Martha, who'd known him for decades, seemed to be watching him more carefully, as if expecting him to transform into someone else entirely now that money had entered the picture. The telephone rang while Red was finishing his coffee. Martha answered with her usual brisk efficiency, then covered the mouthpiece and looked at Red with raised eyebrows. "It's another lawyer. This one says he represents your nephew in California." Red's stomach soured. He'd been dreading this call since Whitman had mentioned the relatives circling like vultures. His nephew, Derek, was Dale's oldest boy, the one who'd always seemed too slick for Red's taste. Derek had visited exactly once in 20 years, stayed for 2 uncomfortable days, and left early with some excuse about business obligations. "Tell him I'm not here," Red said. Martha shook her head. "You can't avoid this forever. Better to find out what they want now rather than let them lawyer up behind your back." She handed him the phone with a look that brooked no argument. Derek's voice came through the line with the practiced enthusiasm of a salesman. "Uncle Red, I was so sorry to hear about Sarah and the boy. Terrible tragedy, just terrible." "Thank you," Red said carefully. "Listen, I've been talking to my sisters and some of the other family members, and we're all concerned about you. This inheritance thing, it's a lot for one person to handle, especially someone who's dealing with grief. We think it might be better if the family worked together on this, shared the burden." Red felt anger building in his chest like steam in a boiler. "What burden is that, Derek?" "Well, the legal complications, the taxes, the investment decisions. This kind of money comes with responsibilities. My lawyer says there could be serious tax implications if it's not handled properly. And then there's the question of whether one person should control such a large amount of resources when there are other family members who could benefit. Other family members who never called, never visited, never cared whether Sarah and I were alive or dead," Red said, his voice getting harder. Derek's tone became more conciliatory. "I know we haven't been as close as we should have been, Uncle Red. Distance makes things difficult, and everyone gets busy with their own lives. But we're still family, and family should stick together, especially in times like this." Red looked across the kitchen table at Martha, who was listening to his side of the conversation with growing indignation. She made a gesture that Red interpreted as "hang up on the selfish bastard," and he was tempted to follow her advice. "What exactly are you proposing, Derek?" Red asked instead. "My lawyer thinks the fairest approach would be to divide the inheritance among all of Dad's surviving relatives. That way everyone benefits, and no one person has to carry the burden of managing such a large estate. It's what Dad would have wanted. He always believed in taking care of family." Red almost laughed at that. Dale had believed in taking care of Dale, and his children had inherited that same self-centered philosophy. "Your father borrowed $500 from me in 1987 to help with your sister's college tuition," Red said quietly. "He promised to pay it back as soon as he got on his feet. Never saw a penny of it. When I asked him about it a few years later, he said I was being petty about family helping family." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Derek spoke again, the voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. "That was a long time ago, Uncle Red. People make mistakes when they're young. The important thing is that we're all family, and this inheritance is a chance for everyone to benefit." "Tell you what, Derek," Red said, standing up and walking to Martha's kitchen window. Outside, he could see the elementary school where Sarah had taught, where she dedicated her life to helping children learn and grow. "You give me your lawyer's contact information. My lawyer will call your lawyer, and they can sort out what's legal and what's not. But I'll tell you right now, Sarah and I never asked your family for anything, and we're not about to start taking orders from you now." "Uncle Red, I think you're misunderstanding." Red hung up the phone and immediately felt better. Martha was grinning at him from across the table, her expression showing the same satisfaction she probably felt when putting an unruly student in their place. That felt good, didn't it?" she said. "Better than it should have," Red admitted, "but now I really do need to find a lawyer. Someone who can protect Sarah and Tommy's interests, not just grab whatever they can get." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "I know just the person, Marcus Webb. He handled Sarah's will and the school district's legal work for years. Honest as the day is long, and he won't try to get rich off your troubles." An hour later, Red was sitting in Marcus Webb's modest office, surrounded by law books and family photos that spoke of a man who valued substance over show. Webb was perhaps 50, with the kind of steady manner that reminded Red of the better sort of mountain folk people who said what they meant and meant what they said. "I've heard about your situation," Webb said after Red had explained about the inheritance and the family pressure. "Word travels fast in legal circles, especially when there's this much money involved. You're going to need protection from more than just your relatives, Red. There are mining companies, environmental groups, tax authorities, and probably a dozen other interests that will want a piece of this." Red pulled out the wrinkled school report card he'd found in the ruins, Tommy's last report card, showing A's in reading and science, with a teacher's note that the boy was curious about everything and eager to help others learn. The card was damaged but readable, a reminder of the bright future that had been cut short. "I don't want to fight about money," Red said, holding the report card carefully. "I want to do something that would make Sarah and Tommy proud. But I need help figuring out how to do that without getting destroyed by people who think I'm stupid enough to be taken advantage of." Webb studied the report card with the attention it deserved, understanding that this wasn't about legal documents, but about honoring memory and love. "Then that's what we'll do," he said simply. "Let me handle the vultures, while you figure out how to turn this inheritance into something meaningful." 2 weeks after meeting with Marcus Webb, Red stood in the cemetery where Sarah and Tommy lay buried side by side under matching granite headstones. The morning sun slanted through the pine trees that surrounded the small mountain graveyard, and Blue sat patiently beside him, understanding that this was a place for quiet thoughts and long silences. Red had been coming here every few days since returning to town, always carrying something different in his pocket. Today it was his father's compass, a brass instrument worn smooth by decades of handling, passed down through 3 generations of McAllister men who'd made their living in the wilderness. His father had given it to him on his 16th birthday with simple words, "A man needs to know where he's going, son, and how to find his way back home." "I don't know where I'm going anymore, Sarah," Red said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "That compass used to point toward you and Tommy, toward the life we built together. Now it just spins around like it's broken." He knelt down beside Sarah's grave, brushing away the pine needles that had accumulated since his last visit. Someone, probably Martha, had left fresh wild flowers in the small vase at the base of the headstone. Sarah would have liked that. She'd always preferred mountain flowers to the fancy arrangements from the florist in town. "Martha showed me your list," Red continued, pulling the folded paper from his jacket pocket. "All those dreams you had about helping kids. I've been thinking about them, trying to figure out what you'd want me to do with all this money that came out of nowhere." The inheritance proceedings were moving forward, despite the legal challenges from his relatives. Marcus Webb had filed all the necessary paperwork and was confident that Red's claim would stand up in court. But the process was complicated by environmental concerns. The mine site was located near watershed areas that provided drinking water for 3 counties, and several conservation groups were arguing that any mining operation would threaten the region's ecosystem. Red actually found himself agreeing with the environmentalists more than the mining companies. The idea of tearing up the mountains to extract wealth felt wrong somehow, like desecrating something sacred. But Marcus had explained that Red could control how the resources were developed, that ownership gave him the power to set conditions and limitations that would protect the land while still generating income. "The school board met yesterday," Red told Sarah's headstone. "Martha said they're desperate for funding. The state cut their budget again, and they're talking about combining classes, maybe even closing the elementary school entirely. Can you imagine that? All those kids having to bus 40 miles to town just to get an education. Red had attended that school. Board meeting, sitting in the back row and listening as the members discussed budget shortfalls and difficult decisions. The building where Sarah had taught for 30 years was showing its age: leaky roof, outdated heating system, computers that barely functioned. The library consisted of books that were old when Red was a child, and the playground equipment was held together with rust and hope. After the meeting, Red had approached the school board president, a woman named Ellen Torres, who'd been one of Sarah's former students. She'd recognized him immediately, offering condolences and asking how he was managing. When Red had quietly mentioned that he might be able to help with some of the school's financial needs, Ellen's eyes had lit up with the kind of desperate hope that comes from fighting losing battles for too long. "We could really use a guardian angel right about now," Ellen had said. "Sarah always talked about how much this community meant to her. She'd be thrilled to know someone cares enough to help keep her school alive." Red had promised to think about it, but his mind was already made up. The first thing he wanted to do with his inheritance was ensure that the school where Sarah had dedicated her career would continue serving mountain children for generations to come. But he wanted to do more than just throw money at immediate problems. He wanted to create something lasting, something that would honor both Sarah's memory and Tommy's unrealized potential. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path interrupted Red's thoughts. He looked up to see a young woman approaching with a small child in tow. The woman was maybe 30, with the kind of practical clothes and weathered hands that spoke of hard work and mountain living. The boy was perhaps 6 years old, with bright eyes and the boundless energy of childhood barely contained by the solemn atmosphere of the cemetery. "I'm sorry to disturb you," the woman said, hesitating at the edge of the gravesite. "I'm Jenny Morrison, and this is my son, Luke. We just wanted to pay our respects to Mrs. McAllister. She was Luke's teacher last year." Red stood up, recognizing the name. Sarah had talked about Luke Morrison, a bright boy from a family that struggled financially, parents who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, but still couldn't afford some of the basic school supplies their son needed. "She was a good teacher," Red said simply. "She loved her students." Luke stepped forward, his small voice clear and serious. "Mrs. McAllister helped me learn to read better. She said I was smart enough to do anything I wanted when I grew up. She gave me books to take home so I could practice." Red felt his throat tighten. This was exactly the kind of thing Sarah would do, quietly helping a struggling student, making sure no child fell behind because of circumstances beyond their control. She'd probably bought those books with her own money, never thinking to mention it to Red. "She was right," Red told Luke. "You are smart enough to do anything you want. Don't let anybody tell you different." Jenny Morrison smiled gratefully. "She made such a difference in his life. Luke still talks about her every day, asks when she's coming back to school. It's hard to explain to a 6-year-old that some people don't come back." After they left, Red sat back down beside the graves, his father's compass warm in his palm. The brass instrument was still pointing steadily north, just as it had for 60 years. Maybe it wasn't broken after all. Maybe it was trying to tell him that finding direction wasn't about knowing exactly where you were going, it was about having principles that didn't waver, values that stayed constant even when everything else in your life changed. "I'm going to fix the school, Sarah," Red said quietly, "and then I'm going to figure out how to help kids like Luke, smart kids who just need someone to believe in them the way you always did. I think that's what you'd want me to do with this money. I think that's what would make Tommy proud." The wind stirred through the pine trees, carrying the scent of mountain air and the promise of changing seasons. Red pocketed his father's compass and stood up, Blue rising beside him with the patient loyalty that had become Red's most reliable comfort. For the first time since the fire, Red felt like he knew which direction he needed to walk. The Sarah and Tommy McAllister Education Foundation became real on a Tuesday morning in October when Marcus Webb handed Red the incorporation papers and a checkbook that represented more money than Red had ever imagined having. The foundation's first act was a check for $50,000 to repair the elementary school's roof and heating system, enough to keep Sarah's former classroom warm and dry through the coming winter. Red insisted on being present when the contractors started the repair work, partly because he wanted to see that the job was done right, but mostly because standing in Sarah's empty classroom helped him feel closer to the purpose that was slowly taking shape in his mind. The room still smelled faintly of chalk dust and construction paper, and the walls were covered with the kind of cheerful educational posters that Sarah had believed could make any child excited about learning. Martha found him there one afternoon, sitting at Sarah's old desk and going through a box of her teaching materials that the school district had saved. "You know, she kept a journal," Martha said without preamble, settling into one of the small student chairs that made her look like a giant visiting a dollhouse. Red looked up from the lesson plans he'd been examining. "What kind of journal?" "Teaching journal. She wrote down notes about each student, what worked with them, what didn't. Ideas for helping the ones who struggled." Martha reached into her purse and pulled out a worn notebook, bound in faded blue cloth. "She asked me to keep it after she retired, said maybe someday it might help another teacher. But I think it might help you understand what she really cared about." Red accepted the journal with the reverence he might have shown a religious text. Sarah's handwriting filled every page, observations about individual students, innovative teaching methods, reflections on the challenges of educating mountain children who often came from families where formal education wasn't valued or understood. One entry, dated just 2 months before the fire, caught his attention. "Luke Morrison is reading 2 grade levels behind, but not because he lacks intelligence. Home situation makes homework impossible, no quiet space, no parental support, often hungry. Brought him crackers and juice today. Need to find way to help without making family feel ashamed. Education shouldn't depend on circumstances of birth." Red read entry after entry, seeing patterns emerge in Sarah's concerns. Too many bright children held back by poverty. Families that wanted to help their kids but didn't know how. A system that assumed all children had the same advantages when starting their educational journey. "She worried about them," Red said, looking up at Martha. "All of them. Even the ones who weren't in her class anymore." "That's who Sarah was," Martha replied. "She never stopped being their teacher, even after they moved on. She'd ask about former students, follow their progress, worry when they struggled." Martha gestured at the journal. "She had ideas about how to fix things, but teachers don't have the resources to implement the kind of changes she envisioned." Red turned the page and found Tommy's baseball glove drawn in the margin next to notes about helping children develop confidence through achievement. Sarah had written, "T loves baseball but gets frustrated when he can't hit like older kids. Reminded me that success comes in small steps. Maybe confidence in one area helps with confidence in learning." The glove drawing was simple but detailed, showing the worn leather and careful stitching of Tommy's most prized possession. The boy had been so proud of that glove, carrying it everywhere during his visits, begging Red to play catch, even when the weather wasn't cooperative. Red could picture Tommy's face lighting up whenever he managed to catch a difficult throw, the pure joy of a child discovering what he was capable of achieving. "Martha, what if we did more than just fix the school building?" Red asked, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "What if we created programs for kids like Luke, kids who need extra support?" Martha leaned forward, her expression shifting from casual conversation to serious attention. "What kind of programs?" "After-school tutoring, maybe. Summer programs for kids who fall behind during the year. Scholarships for families who can't afford school supplies or field trips." Red was thinking out loud, ideas coming faster than he could organize. "Plays them. Sarah always said education was about more than just sitting in a classroom. What if we gave these kids experiences they'd never have otherwise?" That would take more than money, Red. It would take staff, organization, ongoing commitment. Then we find the right people, Red said with growing conviction. We find teachers like Sarah who care about more than just getting through the curriculum. We pay them well enough that they don't have to work second jobs to make ends meet. We create something that would make Sarah proud. Martha smiled, the expression transforming her practical features. She would be proud. And you know what else? Tommy would be too. That boy always wanted to help other people remember how he used to share his toys with younger kids, even strangers at the park. Red did remember. Tommy had possessed the kind of generous spirit that seemed to come naturally to some children, the instinct to include others rather than exclude them. It had been one of the qualities that made Red believe the boy would grow up to be a good man, someone who made the world a little better just by being in it. The sound of hammering from the roof interrupted Red's thoughts, reminding him that change was already beginning. But fixing the building was just the start. What he was contemplating now was much more ambitious, creating an entirely new approach to supporting mountain children's education. "There's something else," Red said, closing Sarah's journal carefully. "Marcus Webb told me that the legal challenges from my relatives are getting more aggressive. They've hired a bigger law firm, one that specializes in inheritance disputes. And there's a mining company called Apex Resource Development that's been asking questions about my plans for the mine site." Martha's expression darkened. "What kind of questions?" "Whether I'm really serious about environmental restrictions, how quickly I want to begin extraction, if I might be willing to sell outright, rather than manage development myself." Red stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had shaped his entire life. "I get the feeling they think I'm just some ignorant mountain man who can be intimidated or bought off." "Are you worried about the legal challenges?" Red thought about that for a moment, surprised to realize that he wasn't. A month ago, the idea of fighting wealthy relatives and powerful corporations would have terrified him. But something had changed as he'd begun to understand what he wanted to do with his inheritance. Purpose, he realized, was a powerful antidote to fear. "Let them come," Red said finally. "I've got something worth fighting for now. Sarah and Tommy deserve better than having their memory used as an excuse for other people's greed." Outside the window, contractors were installing new gutters that would protect the school for decades to come. It was a small start, but Red could see the potential for something much larger, a legacy that would honor his family, while helping countless children achieve dreams that poverty might otherwise make impossible. Martha waited until Red had finished his morning coffee before she handed him the envelope. Her face carried the particular expression of someone who'd been wrestling with a difficult decision for too long, and Red knew immediately that whatever was inside would change things. "Sarah asked me to give this to you 6 months after the funeral," Martha said quietly. She was very specific about the timing. "She said you'd need that long to start healing before you could handle what's inside." The envelope was cream-colored paper, expensive stuff that Sarah would never have bought for ordinary correspondence. Red's name was written on the front in Sarah's careful script, but there was something formal about the way she'd written it, as if this letter existed outside their usual intimate relationship. Red opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Not from age, but from the sudden certainty that his understanding of everything was about to shift in ways he couldn't predict. Inside was a single sheet of paper and something wrapped in tissue, Sarah's hidden letter and what felt like a small piece of jewelry. "My dearest Red," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then Martha has honored my request, and I am no longer with you. I pray that the pain of losing me has begun to soften into something you can carry without it breaking you entirely." Red had to stop reading for a moment, overwhelmed by hearing Sarah's voice again through her written words. Blue, who'd been lying peacefully by Red's feet, lifted his head and whined softly, as if sensing the emotional weight of whatever was happening. "There is something I should have told you years ago, but I was afraid it would cause you more pain than healing. Our Tommy was not our grandson, Red. He was our son, The words hit Red like a physical blow. He read the sentence 3 times before its meaning penetrated the fog of confusion that suddenly filled his mind. Tommy was their son? But that meant our daughter Jessica died in that car accident when Tommy was 2 years old, just as we told everyone. But what we didn't tell people, what I couldn't bear to tell you, was the truth about Jessica's life before the accident. She had struggled with addiction for years. Red, the drugs took her long before the car crash made it final. Tommy had been living with us since he was 6 months old, not just visiting. I legally adopted him as our grandson because I was afraid if people knew the truth about Jessica's problems, they might take Tommy away from us. Red's vision blurred as memories rearranged themselves in his mind. All those visits from Tommy, they hadn't been visits at all. The boy had lived with them full time, but Sarah had maintained the fiction that he was their grandson to protect both Tommy and Red from the shame and legal complications surrounding Jessica's addiction. I know this changes everything, my love. Tommy wasn't just the bright boy who would carry on our family name. He was our actual son, the child we raised from infancy to replace the daughter we lost to her demons. Every story I told about his parents visiting, every explanation about why he spent so much time with us, was a lie I told to protect all of us from a truth too painful to bear. Red unwrapped the tissue paper with hands that shook violently now. Inside was Tommy's class ring from his tiny school, a small thing made of brass and plastic that the school had given all the children as a reward for good behavior. Tommy had worn it constantly, calling it his good boy ring and showing it to anyone who would pay attention. He never knew Red. To Tommy, we were Grandpa and Grandma, and that was enough. But legally, morally, in every way that mattered, he was our son. The inheritance you've received, the money that must seem like such a burden, Tommy should have inherited it someday. He was your direct heir, not just a beloved grandchild. The implications crashed over Red like an avalanche. The legal challenges from his relatives, the fights over inheritance rights, the complicated questions about who deserved what, all of it took on new meaning. Tommy hadn't been a grandchild who might or might not have had claims to Red's estate. He'd been Red's legal son, which meant his death had extinguished a direct line of inheritance that no distant cousin or scheming nephew could challenge. I'm telling you this now because I suspect that if something happens to both Tommy and me, you'll find yourself facing decisions about money and legacy that will seem overwhelming. But remember this, my darling man, you are not responsible to people who never cared about us when we were struggling. You owe nothing to relatives who ignored us when we needed support. Tommy was your son, and any inheritance you use to honor his memory and potential is exactly what a loving father should do. Red had to stand up and walk to Martha's window, his mind reeling from the revelations. Tommy had been his son. For 6 years, he'd been raising his own child while thinking he was just being a devoted grandfather. Every moment of pride he'd felt in the boy's accomplishments, every dream he'd harbored about Tommy's future, every prayer he'd whispered for the child's safety and happiness, all of it had been the feelings of a father, not a grandfather. There are legal documents in our safe deposit box that confirm Tommy's adoption and his status as our legal child, the letter continued. Marcus Webb has a key and knows to retrieve them if anything happens to both of us. The adoption was handled quietly, but correctly. Tommy's inheritance rights were always secure. Martha was watching Red's face with the careful attention of someone who'd helped keep this secret for years. You knew, Red said. Not a question but a call. Statement. Sarah asked me to witness the adoption papers, Martha admitted. She was terrified that someone would challenge Tommy's place in your family if the truth came out. Jessica's problems were well known to social services. There were concerns about drug exposure, neglect, unsafe living conditions. Sarah was afraid that admitting Tommy was your son, not your grandson, might trigger investigations that could result in him being placed with other relatives or even in foster care. Red sank back into his chair. overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Sarah had done to protect their family. She'd created an entire fictional framework to ensure Tommy's safety and security, sacrificing her own need for honesty to guarantee that the boy would never be taken away from the only stable home he'd ever known. "The mining inheritance," Red said slowly, understanding dawning. "It doesn't belong to a bunch of distant relatives trying to cash in on unexpected luck. It belongs to Tommy's memory. It belongs to the future he should have had." "That's exactly right," Martha said, "and Sarah knew that when you understood that, you'd fight for it differently. Not as someone who accidentally came into money, but as a father protecting his son's legacy." Red thought about Derek and the other relatives who'd been pressuring him to share the inheritance. They'd been positioning themselves as equal claimants to a windfall that should have gone to Red's child. The legal challenges, the emotional manipulation, the assumption that Red was too simple to manage his own affairs, all of it took on a different character when viewed through the lens of fathers and sons instead of distant family obligations. "There's one more thing in the envelope," Martha said gently. Red reached back into the cream-colored paper and found a smaller envelope marked, "For when you're ready to fight." Inside was a single photograph, Tommy at age 6, wearing his little class ring and holding a sign. He'd made that read, "I want to help kids learn to read like Grandpa taught me." The photo had been taken in Sarah's classroom during one of the school's reading celebration days. Tommy was beaming with the unself-conscious joy of a child who discovered something wonderful and wanted to share it with everyone. Behind him, barely visible on the classroom wall, was a poster Sarah had made, listing her dreams for expanded educational programs, the same dreams that Red was now working to make real. Red stared at the photograph until his vision blurred with tears he'd been holding back for months. This wasn't just about honoring Sarah's memory or using inherited wealth responsibly. This was about completing the life that Tommy should have had, fulfilling the potential of a boy who'd wanted to help other children learn and grow. "They don't know about this, do they?" Red asked, holding up the adoption documentation. "My relatives, the mining company lawyers, they still think Tommy was just a grandchild." Martha shook her head. "Sarah made me promise to keep the secret until you were ready to use it. She said you'd know when the time came to stop letting other people treat you like you don't deserve what's rightfully yours." Red carefully folded Sarah's letter and placed it back in the envelope along with Tommy's class ring and the photograph. For months, he'd been struggling with guilt about his inheritance, feeling somehow unworthy of such sudden wealth. But Tommy had been his son, and sons inherit their father's estates. What Red did with the money wasn't charity or luck. It was a father's responsibility to honor his child's memory and potential. "The time has come," Red said quietly. And for the first time since the lawyer had found him walking on that dusty road, he felt like the inheritance truly belonged to him. The courthouse in Billings had never seemed so imposing to Red as it did on the morning when everything would be decided. Marcus Webb walked beside him up the granite steps, carrying a briefcase full of documents that would either secure Tommy's legacy or surrender it to people who'd never cared about the boy when he was alive. "Remember," Marcus said as they paused outside the heavy wooden doors, "let me do the talking unless the judge asks you a direct question. Your relatives' lawyers are going to try to provoke you, make you look unstable or incompetent. Don't give them the satisfaction." Red nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the small piece of paper he carried in his shirt pocket. It was a drawing Tommy had made. During his last visit, a crayon sketch of himself helping younger children read, with the words, "When I grow up, I want to help kids like Grandpa and Grandma," written in his careful 8-year-old handwriting across the bottom. Martha had found the drawing in one of Sarah's teaching files, saved along with dozens of other student artworks that she'd treasured over the years. But this one was different. This one showed Tommy's dreams for his future, the way he'd planned to use his education and advantages to help children who didn't have the same opportunities. Red had spent the past week preparing for this moment, not just legally but emotionally. He'd visited every place that held memories of Tommy, the fishing spot where Red had taught him to cast a line, the meadow where they'd collected wildflowers for Sarah, the old oak tree where Tommy had carved his initials next to Red's own from decades earlier. Each visit had strengthened Red's resolve. This wasn't about money anymore, if it ever had been. This was about ensuring that Tommy's dreams didn't die with him, that the boy's generous spirit could continue to help other children even though he was gone. The courtroom was packed with more people than Red had expected. His relatives occupied 2 full rows, cousins and nephews, and distant family members who'd traveled from 3 states to claim their piece of his inheritance. They were dressed in their best clothes and wore expressions of barely concealed greed, as if they were attending an auction rather than a legal proceeding. Across the aisle sat representatives from Apex Resource Development, the mining company that wanted to buy Red's claim outright rather than deal with his environmental restrictions and charitable intentions. Their lawyers looked expensive and predatory, the kind of men who probably billed more per hour than Red had made in a year during his logging days. But Red also noticed supporters in the gallery. Ellen Torres from the school board was there, along with several teachers who'd worked with Sarah over the years. Jenny Morrison sat with her son Luke, who waved shyly at Red before his mother gently reminded him that they were in court. Martha, of course, was in the front row, her expression radiating the fierce loyalty of someone prepared to fight for family. The judge was a woman in her 60s, named Elizabeth Crenshaw, with silver hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of human foolishness in her decades on the bench. She reviewed the case files with methodical attention before calling the proceedings to order. Derek's lawyer spoke first, a smooth man named Davidson who painted a picture of an elderly, grief-stricken widower who was clearly not competent to manage such a large inheritance. "Your Honor, the defendants argue that this fortune should be distributed among all surviving family members according to principles of fairness and shared responsibility. My client and his family are concerned that Mr. McAllister, in his current emotional state, is making impulsive decisions about charitable giving that could result in the irresponsible dissipation of assets that rightfully belong to the entire family." Red felt his anger rising as Davidson continued to portray him as a simple-minded old man who needed protection from his own generosity. The lawyer made Red's plans for the Education Foundation sound like the confused ramblings of someone who didn't understand money, rather than the carefully considered legacy of a father honoring his son's dreams. Apex Resource Development's attorney was more direct. His argument centered on the claim that Red's environmental restrictions would prevent proper development of the mining site, essentially wasting a natural resource that could benefit the entire region. Mr. McAllister's sentimental attachment to environmental preservation, the lawyer argued, should not override the economic needs of Montana communities that would benefit from responsible resource extraction. When Marcus Webb stood to present Red's case, he began with something that caught everyone by surprise. He called Martha to the witness stand. "Mrs. Henderson," Marcus said, "how long have you known the McAllister family?" 35 years, Martha replied, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "I was Sarah McAllister's teaching partner and closest friend. I watched them raise their son Tommy from the time he was a baby." A murmur went through the courtroom at Martha's use of the word son rather than grandson. Derek's lawyer leaned forward, clearly sensing that something important was happening. "Can you tell the court about Tommy's legal relationship to Red and Sarah McAllister?" Marcus asked. Martha looked directly at Red, drawing strength from his encouraging nod. Tommy was their adopted son, legally and in every other way that mattered. Sarah adopted him after their daughter Jessica died, but they chose to raise him as their grandson to protect him from the stigma surrounding Jessica's addiction problems. The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Red heard Derek's sharp intake of breath, saw the mining company lawyers exchanging urgent whispers. The entire foundation of the inheritance challenge had just shifted beneath their feet. Marcus continued, methodically, introducing the adoption papers, Sarah's letter, and testimony from the social worker who'd helped arrange Tommy's placement. Each piece of evidence strengthened the case that Tommy had been Red's direct heir, not a peripheral family member whose death opened inheritance questions for distant relatives. Furthermore, Marcus said, the evidence shows that Mr. McAllister's plans for his inheritance are not the impulsive acts of a grieving man, but the thoughtful decisions of a father seeking to honor his son's memory and dreams. Marcus introduced Tommy's drawing, projecting it on a screen where everyone in the courtroom could see the 8-year-old's careful planning for his future as someone who would help other children learn. The simple crayon sketch carried more emotional weight than all the legal arguments combined. When Red finally took the witness stand, he felt calmer than he'd expected. The truth was simpler than all the legal complexities that had surrounded. Tommy was my son, Red said, his voice steady and clear. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that mattered. Sarah and I raised him from the time he was 6 months old. We taught him to fish and ride horses and read books and treat other people with respect. We watched him grow into a boy who wanted to spend his life helping other kids learn and grow. Red pulled out Tommy's drawing and held it up so the judge could see it clearly. This inheritance doesn't belong to cousins who never called or visited when we needed them. It doesn't belong to mining companies that want to tear up the mountains where my family lived and died. It belongs to the future Tommy should have had, and I'm going to use every penny of it to make sure other children get the chances he'll never have. Derek's lawyer tried to challenge Red's competency, asking pointed questions about his education and business experience. But Red's answers were thoughtful and grounded, demonstrating a clear understanding of his responsibilities and goals. When the lawyer suggested that Red was being manipulated by outside interests who wanted to exploit his generosity, Red's response was sharp and direct. "The only people trying to manipulate me are sitting right over there," Red said, pointing at his relatives. "They want money they didn't earn from a family they never supported. My son's legacy isn't for sale to people who couldn't be bothered to attend his funeral." The mining company's lawyer tried a different approach, arguing that Red's environmental concerns would prevent the responsible development of valuable resources. But Red was ready for that too. "I'm not against mining," Red said. "I'm against destroying the land where my family lived for 4 generations just to make a quick profit. If we develop that site, we're going to do it in a way that protects the watershed and the wildlife and the communities that depend on clean water and air. Tommy loved these mountains. I'm not going to let anyone turn them into a wasteland in his name." As the day wore on, Red could see the tide turning in their favor. The revelation about Tommy's true relationship to him had undercut the relatives' claims, and Red's thoughtful testimony had demonstrated his competency to manage his inheritance. The Education Foundation's plans, outlined in detail by Marcus, showed careful consideration and professional oversight, not impulsive charity. But Red knew the fight wasn't over. Even if they won this battle, there would be appeals, continued challenges, ongoing attempts to prevent him from using his inheritance the way Tommy would have wanted. The mining companies and greedy relatives wouldn't give up easily on a $100 million prize. As court recessed for the day, Red stood on the courthouse steps and looked out at the mountains that had shaped his entire life. Tomorrow, Judge Crenshaw would render her decision. Tomorrow, he'd learn whether Tommy's dreams would become reality or whether his son's legacy would be carved up among people who'd never loved him. Red touched the drawing in his pocket one more time, drawing strength from his son's hopeful vision of the future. Whatever happened tomorrow, Red had fought for something worth defending. Sarah would be proud of him for that, and so would Tommy. Judge Elizabeth Crenshaw entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing behind her like the wings of some great bird of justice. Red sat in the front row beside Marcus Webb, his hands folded around the wooden gavel that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who'd served as justice of the peace in these same mountains for 30 years before Red was born. The gavel was carved from Montana pine, worn smooth by decades of use in settling disputes between neighbors who valued fairness over legal technicalities. Red's grandfather had believed that justice was about more than following written law. It was about understanding what was right in your heart and having the courage to act on that understanding. All rise, the bailiff commanded, and Red stood with everyone else, feeling the weight of 3 generations of McAllister men who'd faced their troubles, standing upright with their shoulders back. Judge Crenshaw settled behind her bench and surveyed the packed courtroom with the measured gaze of someone who'd presided over every variety of human conflict. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the section where Red's relatives sat, then moved to the mining company representatives, and finally settled on Red himself. This case presents interesting questions about inheritance, family responsibility, and the rights of property owners to determine how their assets are used, she began, her voice carrying easily through the hushed courtroom. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence presented by both sides, and I'm prepared to render my decision. Red felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he kept his breathing steady the way his grandfather had taught him during hunting season. When you're waiting for the crucial moment, stay calm and keep your hands ready. Regarding the primary inheritance claim, Judge Crenshaw continued, the evidence clearly establishes that Thomas McAllister was the legal adopted son of Red and Sarah McAllister, not merely their grandson as originally assumed. The adoption papers are properly executed and legally binding. This fundamentally changes the inheritance dynamics in this case. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expensive lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. The mining company representatives maintained their poker faces, but Red could see the tension in their shoulders. The testimony presented by distant relatives arguing for shared inheritance rights is not supported by law or precedent, Judge Crenshaw said, her tone becoming more decisive. When a man's direct heir predeceases him, the inheritance passes according to the media's, deceased's wishes and legal property rights. Extended family members have no automatic claim to assets simply because they share genetic heritage with the deceased. Red felt Martha's hand squeeze his shoulder from behind, a gesture of support that reminded him he wasn't fighting this battle alone. The truth about Tommy had given them the legal foundation they needed, but Red knew the judge was considering more than just technicalities. However, Judge Crenshaw continued, and that single word sent a chill through Red's chest, this court must also consider questions of competency and responsible stewardship. The defendants have raised concerns about Mr. McAllister's ability to manage such a substantial inheritance, particularly given his recent traumatic losses and lack of experience with complex financial matters. This was the moment Red had been dreading. No matter how strong his legal claim, if the judge decided he was incompetent to manage his inheritance, the court could impose restrictions or oversight that would prevent him from honoring Tommy's memory the way he intended. Mr. McAllister, Judge Crenshaw said, looking directly at him, please stand and approach the bench. Red rose slowly, his grandfather's gavel clutched in his left hand, and walked the few steps that separated him from the judge. Behind him, he could hear the rustle of clothing and whispered conversations as everyone in the courtroom strained to hear what would happen next. Sir, Judge Crenshaw said quietly, this court has heard testimony suggesting that you're not qualified to manage $100 million inheritance. Your relatives argue that your grief has impaired your judgment, that your charitable intentions are impractical, that you lack the education and experience necessary to handle such wealth responsibly. Red met the judge's gaze steadily, drawing strength from the worn pine gavel in his hand. Your Honor, I may not have much formal education, but I know the difference between right and wrong. I know what my son would want me to do with this money, and I know I'll sleep better at night helping kids get a good education than I would buying fancy cars or big houses for people who never cared about Tommy when he was alive. Judge Crenshaw studied Red's face for a long moment. as if reading something there that couldn't be captured in legal documents or witness testimony. Mr. McAllister, how do you respond to concerns that your planned charitable foundation might dissipate assets that could otherwise benefit multiple family members? Tommy was my family, Your Honor, the only family that mattered. If I'd died in that fire instead of him, every penny I owned would have gone to that boy's future. Since he can't have a future anymore, I'm going to make sure other kids like him get the chances he'll never have. The judge nodded slowly, then gestured for Red to return to his seat. As he walked back to the defendant's table, Red caught Derek's eye. His nephew was watching him with an expression that mixed calculation with something that might have been grudging respect. Judge Crenshaw reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder that Red recognized immediately. It contained Sarah's previously unknown will, discovered just 2 days earlier in the safe deposit box that Martha had helped Sarah maintain separately from their joint accounts. "Before I render my final decision," Judge Crenshaw said, holding up the document, "the court must address newly discovered evidence that directly relates to this case. Mrs. Sarah McAllister's personal will, 20 executed 6 months before her death, provides specific instructions regarding any inheritance that might come to her family." Marcus Webb had found the will during his final review of the McAllister family's legal documents, hidden among Sarah's teaching certificates and personal papers. When he'd called Red with the news, Red had barely been able to process the implications. Sarah had somehow anticipated the possibility of unexpected wealth and had written explicit instructions for how it should be used. Mrs. McAllister's will states, and I quote, "Should my husband Red come into any significant inheritance or windfall after my death, it is my express wish that such resources be used primarily for educational purposes, specifically to benefit children from families of limited means. Red McAllister is hereby designated as the sole executor of such funds, with complete authority to establish charitable foundations, educational programs, and scholarship funds as he sees fit." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Even Derek's lawyer looked stunned by this development. Sarah had not only endorsed Red's plans for the inheritance, she'd legally mandated them. Judge Crenshaw continued reading, "I have observed my husband's wisdom and character for 45 years. He possesses the moral clarity and practical sense necessary to use any unexpected wealth responsibly and generously. Any family members who might seek to claim portions of such inheritance should understand that our priorities have always been our immediate family first, and the welfare of children second. Extended relatives who have not supported us during our lifetimes have no legitimate claim to support us after our deaths." Red felt tears threatening to overwhelm him. Even in death, Sarah was still protecting their family, still fighting for the values they'd shared throughout their marriage. She'd somehow known that wealth might come to him unexpectedly, and she'd used her final legal act to ensure that Tommy's legacy would be protected from exactly the kind of challenge they were facing now. Furthermore, Judge Crenshaw read, "Mrs. McAllister specifically addressed environmental concerns related to any mining or resource extraction that might be connected to her husband's inheritance. She wrote, 'The mountains of Montana have sustained our family for 3 generations. Any development of natural resources should be conducted with respect for the land that will outlive us all. Profit extracted at the expense of environmental destruction is not profit at all, but theft from future generations.'" Judge Crenshaw set down Sarah's will and looked out over the courtroom, her expression indicating that the legal arguments were finished and the time for decision had arrived. "This court finds that Red McAllister is the sole legitimate heir to the mining inheritance in question. The evidence clearly establishes that Thomas McAllister was his legal son, and no distant relatives have standing to challenge a direct inheritance line." Derek slumped in his seat, his dreams of easy money crumbling before his eyes. The other relatives began whispering among themselves, already calculating whether appeals would be worth the legal costs. Furthermore, Judge Crenshaw continued, this court finds no evidence that Mr. McAllister lacks the competency to manage his inheritance. His testimony demonstrated clear thinking, moral reasoning, and practical planning. His intentions for charitable use of the funds are supported by his deceased wife's explicit wishes and are entirely within his legal rights as property owner. The mining company representatives looked less devastated than the relatives. They'd been prepared for the possibility that they'd have to negotiate with Red rather than simply buying him out. But Red could see in their faces that they understood. His environmental restrictions weren't negotiable positions, but fundamental principles. Mr. McAllister, Judge Crenshaw said, this court upholds your complete ownership of the mining claim and your right to develop or preserve the property according to your own judgment. However, I want to add a personal observation that goes beyond legal requirements. Red stood again, uncertain what additional guidance the judge might offer. In 30 years on this bench, I've seen money destroy more families than poverty ever has. I've watched inheritance disputes turn brothers into enemies and transform grief into greed. But I've also seen wealth used as a tool for remarkable good, when it's guided by people who understand that money is a responsibility, not just an opportunity. Judge Crenshaw looked directly at Red, her expression softening slightly. Your son, Tommy, would be proud of the man you've become through this ordeal. Use this inheritance wisely, sir, and may it bring honor to his memory. Red felt his grandfather's gavel warm against his palm as he gripped it tightly. Justice had been served, not just in legal terms, but in the deeper sense. His grandfather had always taught him right had prevailed over wrong. Love had triumphed over greed, and Tommy's dreams would live on in the lives of children who hadn't even been born yet. Thank you, Your Honor, Red said simply, and for the first time since the fire, he felt truly at peace. 1 year later, Red stood beside the cornerstone of the new Tommy and Sarah McAllister Community Learning Center, watching as 24 mountain children explored the bright, modern classrooms that had risen from what was once just another empty lot in town. The cornerstone was carved from Montana granite, engraved with simple words that captured everything Red hoped the building would represent: built with love, sustained by learning, dedicated to dreams that never die. The inscription included Tommy's dates of birth and death, along with a line from one of his school papers that Martha had saved. I want to help kids read good books and learn about the mountains. Below that, in smaller letters, was Sarah's teaching philosophy. Every child deserves a chance to discover what they're capable of achieving. Blue, now graying but still spry, lay contentedly in the shade nearby, watching the children with the patient attention of a dog who'd learned to find joy in their laughter. Some of the kids had been hesitant around the large cattle dog at first, but Blue's gentle nature had won them over quickly. Now he was an unofficial mascot of the learning center, accepting treats and gentle pets from tiny hands with the dignity of a retired professor emeritus. Luke Morrison is reading at a 7th grade level now, Martha reported, settling beside Red on the bench they'd installed facing the playground. Jenny says he reads everything he can get his hands on: books about science, adventure stories, even the instruction manuals that come with appliances. That boy is going places. Red smiled, remembering the shy 6-year-old who'd visited Sarah's grave that day a year ago. The after-school tutoring program had transformed Luke from a struggling reader into a confident student who helped younger children with their homework. More importantly, the boy had developed the kind of curiosity and confidence that would serve him well no matter what path his life took. The scholarship fund approved 15 kids for summer enrichment programs, Martha continued, consulting the notebook she always carried. They'll spend 3 weeks at the university in Missoula, taking classes in science and literature, visiting museums, experiencing things most mountain kids never get to see. The scholarship program had become one of Red's proudest achievements. Named the Tommy McAllister Future Leaders Fund, it provided opportunities for children from low-income families to participate in educational experiences that were usually reserved for wealthier students. The program covered everything from school supplies and field trips to summer camps and college preparation courses. Red had also quietly established a separate fund to ensure that no child in the county went hungry during the school day. Free breakfast and lunch programs, backpack food programs for weekends, and emergency assistance for families facing temporary hardships, all funded through the Education Foundation and administered with the kind of dignity that preserved pride while providing help. The mining development had proceeded according to Red's carefully negotiated terms. Apex Resource Development had agreed to environmental restrictions that protected the watershed and wildlife habitat while still allowing for profitable extraction of silver and rare earth minerals. Half of Red's ongoing royalties went directly to the Education Foundation, ensuring sustainable funding for decades to come. "I got a letter from Derek yesterday," Martha mentioned casually, though Red could tell she'd been waiting for the right moment to bring it up. "What did he want this time?" Red asked, though without the anger that mention of his nephew's name would have provoked a year earlier. "Actually, it was an apology," Martha said, sounding surprised. "He said watching you build the learning center made him realize what family really means. He asked if he could make a donation to the scholarship fund, not a big one, but something meaningful to him." Red considered that for a moment, watching as a group of children worked together to build an elaborate sandcastle in the playground's sandbox. Tommy would have loved playing with them, would have been the kind of kid who made sure everyone was included in the game. "What do you think we should do about it?" Red asked. "I think we should let him contribute," Martha said. "Sarah always believed people could change if they were given the chance." Maybe Derek finally figured out what he should have learned years ago. A commotion near the building's entrance caught their attention. Ellen Torres was leading a group of visitors through the learning center, potential donors from Billings who'd heard about the program and wanted to see the results for themselves. Red had learned to tolerate these visits, understanding that publicity helped secure additional funding and political support for education initiatives. "Mr. McAllister," Ellen called, waving him over. "These folks would love to hear about the program directly from you." Red stood slowly, his knee protesting as always, and walked toward the group, with Blue following faithfully beside him. A year of public speaking hadn't made him comfortable with attention, but he'd learned to focus on the message rather than the messenger. "The best way to understand what we're doing here is to watch the kids," Red told the visitors, gesturing toward the playground where children were engaged in elaborate games that somehow incorporated lessons about cooperation, problem-solving, and creativity. "We're not just teaching them facts and figures, we're teaching them to believe in themselves, to see possibilities instead of limitations." As the visitors asked questions about funding models and educational outcomes, Red found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a broken man, walking dusty roads, with nothing but grief and a faithful dog. The inheritance had seemed like a cruel joke, vast wealth, arriving just when he'd lost everyone who made wealth meaningful. But Tommy's dreams had given the money purpose, and Sarah's love had given him the strength to fight for those dreams. The learning center wasn't just a building, it was proof that love didn't end with death, that the best parts of people could live on in the lives they touched and the communities they helped build. When the visitors finally departed, Red returned to his bench and pulled out the worn photograph of Tommy holding his handmade sign about helping kids learn to read. The picture was faded now from frequent handling, but the boy's smile remained as bright as ever. "We did it, son," Red whispered to the photograph. "We built something that would make you proud." As the sun set behind the mountains that had sheltered 4 generations of McAllister men, Red felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work, well done, and promises kept. Tommy's legacy would live on in every child who discovered the joy of learning, in every scholarship that opened doors to dreams, in every moment when a struggling student realized that they were capable of more than they'd ever imagined. The inheritance had made it all possible, but love had made it meaningful.